Good morning, church. How are y'all doing today? Good. Good morning, church. I'm always excited to be able to say that. I'm glad whenever I get the opportunity to stand up in front of a group of God's followers and share a message with y'all. I've actually had an opportunity to be a part of a lot of different churches in my life. If you didn't know, I moved around a lot growing up. I was born in Lubbock, Texas. I'll try to give you the short version of this. Born in Lubbock, Texas, and we moved to San Antonio, Texas. Then we moved to Billings, Montana. Then we moved to Hopatcong, New Jersey. And then we moved to Westchester, Pennsylvania. And then we moved to Atlanta, Georgia. And usually when someone asks me where I'm from, I go into that whole story. And whenever I get to Atlanta, that's usually where they've decided that they've heard enough of that story. And they interrupt me and say, wow, you've lived a lot of places. And I usually go, yeah, we have. But today, since y'all can't interrupt me, I'm going to tell you the rest of it, because that's not where it stops. After Atlanta, I moved back to Lubbock, Texas. That's where I went to college. I met my wife there, got married. She wasn't my wife at the time. I met Megan, who later became my wife. We got married. After that, me and her in Lubbock, I'm getting ahead of myself. In Lubbock, met my wife, had my first child, Will. And then we moved to Great Falls, Montana. Lived there for a couple years. That's where I had my second child, Katie. And then we moved to Wichita Falls, Texas, and that's where we had our third child, Clark. And then we moved to Ruidoso, New Mexico, and then now we live here in Midland. So I've moved around a lot, and I'm leaving out some of the summer times where I lived in New Mexico for one summer, working at a summer camp, and I also lived in Prescott, Arizona. I don't know if y'all are from Arizona. It's spelled Prescott, but if you call it Prescott, they get really upset. So it's Prescott, Arizona. Lived there for a summer, and so I've been in a lot of different churches, and in a lot of different kinds of churches up in the Northeast. Churches are pretty small. Usually, sometimes 50 or 60 people is all that we had sitting in the auditorium. There were times where there was only 2 teens in the youth group, and that was me and my sister, who's here today. So thank you for coming up from Lubbock. And so I've been in those churches. When we lived in Atlanta, we went to a really large church. There was thousands of people, and there's over 100 kids in the youth group. And so I've been in a lot of different places, and all of those places have impacted me. All those churches have impacted me. I remember growing up in Hopatcong, New Jersey, Harold Riley teaching the junior high class, and there was 7 or 8 junior high boys that had zero respect for Harold Riley. And he would try to teach us, and we would just derail class, and we would laugh, and we would joke, and we would not let him teach us. But Harold loved us. I actually got to be in Harold's wedding later on when I was a freshman in high school. Like, he loved me. I remember I was blessed in Wichita Falls to actually attend church with 4 of my aunts. So my father, who's also here, it's a family affair today, so my whole family's here. My father is the youngest of 12 kids. All right, there were 6 boys and 6 girls, and he was boy number 6, child number 12. So we have a lot of family. And when we lived in Wichita Falls, I got to go to church with 4 of my aunts, 4 of his sisters that all went to the same church with me. And I had an opportunity every once in a while to get up and preach there too. And I remember the first time that I got up to preach there, one of my aunts, Aunt Margaret, we used to call her Aunt Pug. Now it's Aunt Margaret. And I don't know when or why that changed, but all of a sudden it's Aunt Margaret. I remember she came up to me, and I'd never really heard this phrase. I didn't really know what she meant when she said this, but she walked up to me, and she looked around like she was about to tell me a big secret, making sure no one was listening. And she said, "You better step on my toes this morning." And I was like, "I'm actually going to try not to. I don't know what you mean." She goes, "Tell me what I need to hear, not just what I want to hear." And I was like, "Oh, okay, I got you." And so she was kind of challenging me. She was asking me to challenge her. I got to be a part of a church in Ruidoso, New Mexico, and it's a beautiful community of people, and just very loving, very welcoming, very, very friendly people. And I remember every Sunday, whoever it was that was getting up to preach, usually it was a man named John Duncan, who was the preacher up there. Whenever the preacher would walk to the front to get ready to preach, it was always started by one of 2 men. It was either Freddie or Gary would just shout out from wherever they were sitting in the auditorium, "Preach the word, John Duncan." And it became part of the culture of the church. Like the whole church would join in with this, challenging the preacher. Preach the word. Bring us the truth. I was actually blessed to receive a text this morning from Mike Crowley. He's told me the same thing, preach the word. And I love that. I love that people are hungry to be challenged. I love that people are hungry to be pushed. And unfortunately today, I didn't have a really hard, difficult question to answer, so we're going to have to answer an easy one, which is, what is the meaning of life? And so we chuckle because that's a question that has been asked for thousands of years, but the reality is, we're going to see it here in a second. It's an easy question to answer because it's a what question. What questions are easy? What's for breakfast? Bacon and eggs. That's easy. There's no more questions after that. What's for breakfast? Cereal. Whatever kind of cereal you want. That's an easy question. That's a what question. There's only one answer. But when we ask what's the meaning of life, we're really not asking a what question. We're asking a why question. We're asking, why am I here? Why am I alive in this time and in this place? Why was I born in 1980 in Lubbock, Texas, instead of in 1880 in some other place? Why was I not born in 3080? Why am I born right now? Why am I 37 years old in 2018 instead of 5 years old in 2018 or 95 years old in 2018? Why am I here in this place at this time? Why? And why questions are difficult to answer. Why questions are hard to answer because why is the most powerful question you can ask. Because why is an infinite question. Because no matter what the answer to a why question is, there's always another why. And if you're a parent, you probably know this to be true because your kids say, why can't I have ice cream for breakfast? You say, well, it's not time for ice cream. Well, why not? Well, because ice cream is a later in the day thing. Well, why? Because we've decided at breakfast you should eat something healthy, not sugary. And well, why? Because that's what's better for your body. Why? I don't know. And why just keeps going. It's an infinite question. It's the most powerful question. And why is a question that allows you to speak to power and ask difficult questions of people in power. Why did you make this decision? Well, now they have to explain it. It's not just what are we going to do, it's why are we going to do that? Why questions are hard. And so when we're really asking what's the meaning of life, what we're really asking is why are we here? And so I'm going to answer the what question very quickly. If you're prone to fall asleep in church, don't do it right now, okay? Because if you fall asleep in the next 30 seconds, you're going to miss the meaning of life. I'm about to tell you what it is. Because the power of a why question, let me get back to this for a second. The power of a why question is ultimately it leads to God. Eventually we get to a point where we can't come up with our own answers anymore. So because that's how God wanted it. Why is the sky blue? Like we could talk about ozone layer and refracting light and the color spectrum. We could talk about that, but then you say, well, why does light do that? Well, why? It always gets back to God. And once you get back to God, then you don't have to answer anymore. Like that's the beauty of getting to God is that we can say, well, God's a mystery and we don't understand it, and that's how God wants it. All right. And luckily, God answered the question of what is the meaning of life for us. And so if you follow along with me, I was pointed out today earlier in first service, I said we were going to look at Matthew chapter 23. We're actually looking at Matthew chapter 22. Matthew chapter 22, verse 37. Jesus replied, "Love the Lord your God with all your heart and with all your soul and with all your mind. This is the first and greatest commandment, and the second is like it. Love your neighbor as yourself. All the law and all the prophets hang on these two commands." All right, and then, so that's part of the meaning. And the second part of the what is just a little bit later in Matthew chapter 28, starting in verse 19. It says, "Therefore go and make disciples of all nations, baptizing them in the name of the Father and of the Son and the Holy Spirit, and teaching them to obey everything I have commanded you. And surely I am with you to the very end of the age." That's the what. That's an easy question. What's the meaning of life? Love God, love your neighbors, go into all the world, teach the gospel, make disciples, and teach them how to follow Jesus. That's an easy question, but the why of that is a little bit more difficult. And so, I'm a youth minister, so I brought visual aids to help us understand this. So, let's look at this. because we're gonna dig a little bit deeper into what all those things mean. All right? And so we're going to look at the first one here. Back in Matthew 22, it says, love the Lord with all your heart. Love God with everything that you are. And we're going to call that worship. All right? Now, sometimes when we hear the word worship, we don't necessarily think immediately of love the Lord with all your heart. But that's what we're going to talk about today. Normally, what we kind of think about whenever we think about worship is we think about singing some songs, saying some prayers, kind of our Sunday morning worship service. So, but we're gonna expand that definition to loving God with everything that you are. So that's worship. Second part of that is love your neighbor as yourself. We're going to call that ministry. Again, that's a little bit different than the way we normally think of ministry. A lot of times we think of ministry as the thing that ministers do. That's their job. They're ministers. They do ministry. That's teaching and Bible studies, and it's getting church ready. It's all the things that a minister does. All right. But we're going to change that definition. It's not just those things. Ministry is loving your neighbor as yourself. Loving your neighbor the way that you want to be loved, treating them the way that you want to be treated. All right? And then we look at that, the third part, go into all the world. And we're going to call that mission. Again, we have a little bit different understanding of this. Normally, we think of mission as the thing that missionaries do. They go and they teach the gospel in lots of different places. They go to Africa and South America and in Europe and places where they need Jesus. And that's what a missionary does. But we're going to expand the definition again. Mission is for all of us, going into all the world, going into Midland, going into the places that we work, going into our schools. That's mission and teaching the gospel. So going to all the world, baptizing people in the name of the Father and Son and the Holy Spirit, and we're going to call that fellowship. All right? Again, normally we think of fellowship a little bit differently. Sometimes fellowship is coffee and donuts out in the fellowship hall. That's where fellowship happens. Sometimes fellowship happens over lunch after church, but it's a time for us to kind of visit and talk with each other, and that's what fellowship is. But we're going to expand that and say that fellowship is actually bringing people into the family. It's making them part of what we're doing here. That's what fellowship is, true fellowship. And teaching them to obey. And we're going to call that discipleship. Now, this word is a word that we like in the church, but it's a word that sometimes we don't really understand very well. So we might not even have a clear definition of what it means to practice discipleship or to do discipleship, what discipleship is, but we're gonna talk more about that here in a second. So these are this is what your life is supposed to look like. This is the purpose of life. This is the meaning of life. This is why God created you, to live a life of worship, to live a life of ministry, of mission, live in fellowship with one another, to practice discipleship, to teach people how to be disciples. And so that's the meaning of life. And so here, I have another visual aid. Because we're going to take all these, we're going to put them in here. All right, so we got worship, we got ministry, we have mission, we have fellowship, maybe, there we go, and we have discipleship. All right, well, let's see if we can get this on here. Hold on 1 second. All right. That might be as good as I can do, right there. All right. Now, it doesn't fit, right? And you knew it wasn't going to fit before I even started. You look at how much is there and how small that container is, and you think there's no way all those are going to fit. You're foolish to even try that. And you might be right. You might be right. I might be foolish. Because now I have to catch my breath. But the reality is, this is what a lot of us do with these purposes, with this giant meaning, this giant significant purpose that God created us for, we try to cram all of them in to 1 hour on Sunday morning. And it doesn't fit. It won't fit. And so we look at discipleship and say, okay, well, that's like learning and teaching. So maybe I'll go to class sometimes whenever I'm not too busy. If I'm not too tired, I'll get up and I'll make it to class before second service, and I'll be taught. And then sometimes I know I need to teach too. So maybe twice a quarter or something like that, or 1 quarter a year. Maybe I can make time to practice that, to teach. I need to do that, and so I'll do that when I have time. I'm very busy, so it's hard to fit that in sometimes. But we try to cram that in. We fit that in on Sunday morning. Fellowship, again, I come early, and I have the coffee and I have the donuts, and I visit with people. A lot of Sundays I invite people out to lunch afterwards, and we sit and we visit and we talk. And so there's my fellowship for the week. Mission, I have a job, so I can't really drop everything that I'm doing and go to Africa, go to South America, go to Europe, go to Russia, go to China, go to all the places where they need Jesus. But what I can do is I can write a check, and that check can support people who go and do those things. So, and we'll talk about what our missionaries are doing. We'll pray for our missionaries, and so that's how I'll get involved in mission. Again, we do that on Sunday morning when we pass the plate. Ministry. Again, that's something that the ministers do. My contribution helps makes that happen. Every once in a while, I'll check in with them and say, hey, do you need anything? Hoping that they say, no, but thanks for asking. And then I can go about my business. Hopefully, I don't actually get roped into having to help. But that's what I'll do. There's where my ministry is. And in worship, we get to we'll come and we'll sing some songs. But we got to sing the songs I like. And we got to sing them the speed that I like to sing them. And we got to sing them. We got to sing the new songs, because those are the ones I like. Or we have to sing the old songs, because those are the ones I grew up with. And as long as we sing the right songs in the right tempo, then I'll worship. And as long as the prayers don't go too long, all right? Because some guys get up here, they pray 4.5, 5 minutes. That's too long for a prayer. And so as long as things go right and it fits what I want it to be, then I'll worship. But otherwise, I'm going to leave, and I probably have not worshiped that morning. And that's what we do. And we try to cram all of these things into Sunday morning. And you saw what happened when we did that. It was cramped, and it was tight, and it was tense. And these are symbols for bigger things, but they're also actual pillows, right? So let's talk about a pillow for a second. Whenever we see a pillow, what do we think of? We think of sleep, right? And we think about being able to lay our head on a soft pillow and rest. We think of peace and quiet. We think of comfort. We think of all of those things, and whenever they're all crammed in tight into this little container, can they fulfill any of those purposes? Can they give rest? Can they give comfort? Can they give the peace that they symbolize? No, they can't, because they were never meant to fit in something so tiny. They were meant to fill an entire life. And so this is what an entire life looks like. Filled with worship, filled with ministry, filled with mission, filled with fellowship, and filled with discipleship. And with not with our standard definitions, but with our new, deeper, expanded definitions, this is what life looks like, or should look like. This is what God created us to be. And look, I cut myself, I'm sorry. This is what a life of purpose and fulfillment is supposed to look like. And what is amazing about this is that these pillows fill this thing completely, and they're still soft. They're still doing the things that they were designed to do. Whenever we try to cram these in here, it makes it very difficult. And so whenever we talk about living a life of purpose, this is what God means. It means that whenever we go to work, we're living on mission. We're going into our workplace not just to make money, but to tell people the good news of Jesus. We're going to love our coworkers enough to tell them that there's hope and there's salvation. And we talk a lot about forgiveness of sin. Jesus came to forgive sin. He came to do that, to offer grace and mercy. But he didn't just come to forgive sin. He came to save us from sin. And not just the consequences of sin, but he came to save us from sin itself. Because sin is a cruel dictator, a cruel master. And he came to save us from its clutches. And whenever we start to look at people with truly the way that we love ourselves, the way that we want to be loved, and we start loving people, then we don't let them continue to serve a cruel master who's abusive to them. We tell them there's a better way. Just like my son Clark. I don't know if he's in here. Yeah, he's right back there. I'm specifically not using Clark or Will and Katie for this analogy because I don't have to worry about them doing this. I have to worry about Clark doing this. But if there's a bottle on the countertop and it's got big, bold skull and crossbones on it and big words on the bottom that say poison, Clark still might pick that up and try to drink it. My other two, they're not going to do that. They're not going to do that. But Clark, I worry about Clark sometimes. And I don't know, it's probably something we did. It's probably our fault. But I worry about him, and if I saw him picking that up and bringing it to his lips, I wouldn't just say, well, man, Clark's got to make his own decision. You know, he's got to decide for himself what's best for himself. I'm going to say, no, stop. I'm going to slap it out of his hand. I'm going to say, that will kill you, Clark. And I want to explain to him the consequences of what he's about to do and how that's going to harm him because I love him enough to stop him from drinking poison. And there's a lot of people in the world who are still slaves to sin, slaves to this cruel master that is abusing them. And a lot of times we just, we all make our own decisions. And we do that. But if we truly love someone, we're going to try to save them. Not just offer them the forgiveness of sin, but we're going to try to save them from what sin is doing to them. Because here's the deal. God hates sin. He hates it. But he doesn't just hate it just because it's gross or it's disgusting or he thinks he doesn't want to get his clothes dirty with it. He hates it because it hurts his children. That's why God hates sin, because the sin that we get involved in, the sin that we fall into, it hurts us. And God hates the things that hurt us. And so should we. And so God has called us to live a life full of purpose, full of mission and worship. You know, worship is more than just singing a song. Paul tells us in Romans that our true spiritual act of worship is to live as continual self-sacrificing people. That's our true act of spiritual worship. That's not something that just happens on Sunday mornings. That's something that happens throughout our whole life. And we get so focused on cramming all these into Sunday morning that Sunday morning becomes can become one of the most uncomfortable times of our week. One of the times that we look least forward to because, it's just drudgery sometimes. I don't know if you've ever felt like that. I get paid to be here, and sometimes I feel like that. It can be drudgery. It can be hard because we walk into a place where it's so cramped and it's so tight and it's so tense that it's hard to enjoy those moments. But if we live a life full of purpose, full of meaning, full of the things that God has designed us to do, then when we come to Sunday morning, it's not all these things that have to be crammed in and it has to be perfect and it has to fit just right. We can start to loosen up and breathe a little bit easier. We can start to give each other a little bit more grace. You want to know who has the hardest job in any church? The people that have to recruit people to do things up here on the stage. Who have to get the guys to say the prayer and to read the scripture and to wait on the table and to preach sometimes whenever Mike's out of town. That's the hardest job in the church. And it's because those people a lot of times don't want to get up and do those things. And the reason they don't want to get up and do those things is because they've been to church before. And they've been to lunch after church, and they've heard the conversations that go on about, can you believe how slow the songs were today? Oh my goodness, it was terrible. Can you believe how long that prayer went? That was like a 7-minute prayer. We don't need that. And they hear these conversations, and they certainly don't want to invite themselves into that situation, invite that ridicule on themselves. But if this is the only time that we're worshiping, if this is the only time that we think about mission and ministry and this and fellowship and discipleship, if this is the only chance we get all week to do it, then you're right. It better be perfect. It better be 100% perfect. And I care deeply about what happens on Sunday morning if that's the only time that I'm getting those things, because I need those things. God designed you to have those things in your life. And if that's the only time, then yeah, it better be perfect. But when we can live a life full of these purposes, full of all of these things that God has designed us for, then when we come to Sunday morning, if things don't go exactly right, that's okay, because that's not the only time I'm worshiping this week. Maybe we didn't sing the songs I wanted this week. That's okay. Maybe the songs were too slow. Maybe the prayers were too long. Maybe the preacher went too long. I know that we would never say that. But maybe we stop focusing so much on all of those things, and we get to come and sit in a room full of other people who are living out a life of purpose and just take a deep breath and be in the presence of people who love us, who love God, who we're working together with, that we can actually encourage to go out and to continue to live a life full of these things. Because the reality is, what happens on Sunday morning, if you're a believer, what happens on Sunday morning is not the most important thing in your week. It's 1 hour out of a whole life of all of these things. But there is someone that Sunday morning might be the most important thing to. And that's the person who does not know Jesus, who walks into those doors searching for something. And you can tell a difference when you walk into a church where everything is crammed in here, and it's tight, and it's uncomfortable, and it's tense, and people don't want to come back into that. When they leave at the end of service, they've decided, I'm not going to go back. And they may not get to hear more of the good news of Jesus Christ. But if they walk into a place full of people that look like this, they know that's a place where I can belong. That's a place where they show grace to each other. Did you see how whenever that guy messed up, everyone just kind of laughed and it wasn't a big deal? They don't care. They're free. There's freedom to make mistakes. And I've made mistakes, so maybe I can be a part of this community. Maybe my mistakes don't preclude me from being a part of this family. And when we can start living with a little bit more grace and love and mercy towards each other, people who need grace and mercy and love can come into that place and they can say, this can be home. This can be home. Because we do have a mission, and it's to go out into all the world, but it's also to go out into all of Midland. It's also to go out into my workplace, and it's to go into my school, and it's to go into my family, and it's to go across the street right here to our neighbors and say, hey, there's a better way for you. And so the why of this is because there's people who need Jesus. And so we have to live a life like this so that we can reach people who need Jesus. And that means that some of us are going to have to go home today and make some changes. That means that dads, you're going to have to sit down with your family and you say, hey, some things are going to change around here. And wives, you're going to have to sit down and talk to your husbands and say, hey, some things are going to change around here. We need to make some changes. And kids, you're going to have to go home and tell your parents, some things need to change. And whenever we can change that and we can start living a life like this, we can start reaching more people and bringing people into a relationship with Jesus. And that's what we want. And there's people in here who might not know how to do that. There's people who might not know what the next step is. How do I find my next step with Jesus? So here in a second, Jason's going to come up here and we're going to sing a song of invitation. That's exactly what it is. It is an invitation for you to come forward and to ask for help, to ask for prayers. It's an invitation for you to come forward and to confess, I've been doing it wrong, and I need some help figuring out how to do it right. It's also a time for those of you who have never decided to put Jesus on in baptism, to accept the love and the mercy and the grace that he's offered freely to you. This is your invitation to come forward and to accept those gifts, and I invite you to do that while we stand and sing. I lift my hands, I lift my